Hi everyone, and welcome to the fifth lesson in our GCSE poetry revision series. If you don't know what this channel is all about, we're basically giving you revision tips and tricks and quotes and model paragraphs and all that sort of exam prep stuff that you need ready for these GCSEs that are coming up. If you're doing your GCSEs next year or the year after, congratulations for getting a bit of a head start on it as well. So in the first few weeks of this poetry GCSE course, we looked at bayonet charge and thought about how to analyze structure. In the second week, we went through Mother Any Distance, which is from the Love and Relationships anthology, and we looked at language. Then we looked at My Last Duchess and thought about rhythm and rhyme and tone. And then we did a lesson last week on Manhunt, thinking about themes and motifs. This week, we're going to be going through a poem called Exposure, and I'm going to be doing a time-pressured poetry plan. So I'm actually going to put a timer up and show you how I operate in that sort of roughly 10 minutes that I would recommend maximum for you to put your ideas together for your unseen poetry. So I'll show you how my thought process works on that. And next week, just to give you a bit of a heads up, I'll be doing another time-pressured poetry plan, but a comparative one. So in the unseen sections, normally you just do an analysis of one poem, especially on the larger questions. But some of you will be doing a comparison. Others of you who are doing the poetry anthology, you'll definitely be doing a comparative poetry essay. So I want to show you both. I want to show you how to plan to analyze one poem and also a plan of how you would compare and analyze two poems. So that'll be coming up next week. So yeah, we're going to get started. Something that I will just quickly do is add a timer. If I can I just make a little timer for us, please? That would be good. I don't know if this is going to work well. I sort of had this idea in my head, but I didn't actually sort of think it through that well. That's not bad. Okay, so we'll just put the timer. No, I don't want it to expand. We'll put the timer there. So I will, I'll actually do it more as a, I'll do it as a timer. 10 minutes. So once I start the timer, I will literally go through with you step by step how I'm going to create 3 paragraphs for this question of how does the poet present the suffering of war in Exposure. So this could be quite fun. And then we'll probably write one of those paragraphs. Now, I want to be really clear. I've read Exposure many times in my career, but I haven't ever put myself under a specific 10-minute time frame to do this. I want to encourage you that you can do this. I know it's scary that you're going into these exams and you're being forced to write a lot of volume very quickly on texts that you sometimes haven't even seen before. So I just want to give you a sense of my mindset on how I would approach this. And it's ultimately this thing that I've already talked to you about called art wars, yeah? So as I'm going through the poem, I'm going to be referencing bits of art wars. I'm going to be adding comments. Obviously, in the real exam, what you would do is you would be highlighting bits on your paper copy, assuming you use a paper copy. Otherwise, you'll be doing exactly like me, annotating things if you use a laptop or a PC for your exams. The only other thing I would say, which I've sort of spoken to you before about, is I would start by looking at the structure a little bit before you even dive into the text and read it. So that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. And then as I read, I'm actively reading for how the poet presents the suffering of war. So if something isn't to do with the suffering of war, then I'm not going to include it. Right, give me just a second here because I'm going to need to just need to sort out my screen so that I can have both of these things up at once. So just bear with me a second here. I think if we just split the screen up, that might work. Do that there. Technical difficulties. Okay. Take it off F11. Okay, nearly there. Sorry about this. I don't normally do this, so that's the reason why it's a bit of an issue compared to normal. Okay. Well, I think that will do. So, cool. Not perfect, but I think it will do. I can actually do that as well to make it a bit more cohesive. Right. So 3, 2, 1, off we go. So looking at the structure of the piece, immediately what I see is that it's written in quintets. So I'm going to add that straight away as a comment. Quintets. Now, I'm not sure why it's written in quintets at the moment, but I can see that there is this regularity. The final line seems to be quite repetitive as well. Nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. So this creates another rigidity to the structure. So there is this kind of predictability almost to this. I don't know why exactly, but that's something else I noticed straight away. We have a lot of very heavy punctuation right from the very beginning. So we have ellipsis, ellipsis, ellipsis. We've got a caesura in here. We don't have any enjambement at all that I can see to begin with. And we have this rhetorical question as well. That's a language thing, but I'm sort of going to question that as well. But so there's all this, and now interestingly, we have an enjambed line here. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but that's the first time we've seen enjambment. So that seems to be quite significant. There's no other enjambment here. There's lots of there's some caesura again. So again, this feels very slow pace. Just my impression of it. We're looking for unusual punctuation, so I picked out the ellipsis. We've now also got the hyphenation here. We've got hyphenation there. Again, still no ellipsis, no enjambment here. We've got another caesura here. We've got this hyphenation here. All of this is basically giving me this impression that overall the poem is very slow paced, but for some reason it speeds up a little bit here. I'm not sure why from the enjambment. And just for the sake of time, I'll just look at a couple more things before we dive in and read. So we've got the colon here, semicolon here, semicolon here, caesura here, followed by an ellipsis, which is quite unusual. Semicolon here, hyphen there, semicolon here. So it's all slow, 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 slow. Basically, slow pace continues throughout this entire thing. And the final line of the poem is often significant, and it's interesting that it's this repetition again, nothing happens. Okay, so that's some structural ideas that I've had about the poem. Now let's read the poem. And as we read the poem, we're going to be looking more at language and thinking about word choices and language that specifically links to the suffering of the war. I should have said with structure, you're not necessarily going to be able to immediately link it to suffering. My thinking is that the reason it's slow might be to emphasize the pain or the tedium of war, something like that. But again, I haven't read it yet. I have, but I'm pretending I haven't. Our brains ache in the merciless east winds that knife us. So I've got the personification here of that. It's sort of very negative view of the weather. Worried, we keep awake. So the word wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, centuries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. So there's this anticipation that's being built by the whispering and the curiousness and the nervousness, which is then juxtaposed by the nothing happens. And this also juxtaposes war generally, because we would think of war as being a time where lots of stuff happens. Yet Wilfred Owen is telling us here that nothing happens. There's all this anticipation, maybe anxiety, danger, but actually nothing. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. So the twitching agonies of men, that's very distinctive imagery, which again is imagery of suffering. We've got a reference to the weather again as sort of this enemy. So that's kind of pathetic fallacy. And it produces the enemy being the weather as well, which adds to the suffering, I would think. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles far off like a dull rumor of some other war. What are we doing here? So now thinking about the rhetorical question, when you consider the confusion and everything else, what are we doing here? it creates this sense of suffering needlessly, potentially. So that might be one of my points. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more in ranks of shivering ranks of grey. So now that I've got to the enjambement, I start to see why it's here. So the enjambment helps to give a sense of pace and power of weather as an enemy. That's what comes up now for me from the enjambment, and it creates the suffering of war also being from the elements, from the rain and the cold. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew, we watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Nothing immediately dives out at me that adds to what I've already said, so that's fine. Sometimes, especially in a longer poem, you might not go into every stanza in detail. Obviously, you've got the repetition here, though. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. Now that hyphen also really emphasizes on the very negative imagery, haunting, intimidating. It's this idea that the weather is this monster that's coming out, feeling for their faces and grabbing at them. It's very scary. And the hyphenation really helps to slow down the pace and emphasize that even more. We cringe in holes. So the imagery of this is very animalistic, because we get this sense that the men are the soldiers are reduced to, nothing basically here. Back on forgotten dreams and stare, snow gaze deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? So obviously that hyphenation emphasizes this uncertainty of life or death, which is certainly another way that we could think about suffering. Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed on us. The doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. So this idea that the soldiers aren't even basically the weather and nature is an enemy that is beating them and taking away any comfort. Now, you could argue that that also juxtaposes the earlier thing of the flickering gunnery rumbles far off like a dull rumour. So the actual war effort, the war itself is not the main source of suffering. Since we believe not otherwise can kindle fires burn, now ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring our love is made afraid, therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. So that last line in particular is emphasized because it's shorter and at the end, and it's different from the way that a lot of these finish. So the suffering makes the soldiers question God. Now this was, you don't need to worry about context, but this was written in World War I when most people would have been Christian, especially from England. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shriveling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. So that's called Synecdoche. So the Synecdoche sort of emphasizes the death, image of death. The burying party picks and shovels in shaking grass, pours over half-known faces, all their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Two more quick things. Half-known faces shows that the suffering is in vain, and the eyes are ice. It's this idea, again, it's Synecdoche, that they have become the cold around them. So I have 30 seconds now to try and come up with my 3 points. So I would put suffering mainly from the weather. I would put suffering as futile, and suffering as making soldiers question roles and what they are doing in war. So those would be my 3 points. Let's let the timer go off. Cool. Now I will say, everyone, that was tough because we did have an enormous poem, far longer than any unseen poem normally would be, to be totally honest with you. Like, this is way longer than normal. This is, how many words is this? 336 words. Most poems that you'll get, probably 100, maybe 200 at a push, certainly not 300 plus. If I had a little bit more time, and this is what I would do next, I would then just start to put my quotes in here as well. So we have our 3 points, and then we would add in our quotes. But assuming that you didn't have time to do that, which I didn't in that 10 minutes, it's only fair that I will then show you what to do to write a model paragraph now without having the evidence there. So I would start still with my point. So one of the major ways in which Owen presents the suffering of the soldiers is through it being mainly from the weather. We see this in the quote, and then I am going to have to take just a second to go back and look for a piece of evidence, which I will have already highlighted. So let's do the iced east winds that knife us. I like that quote, and I'm actually going to take the ellipsis as well, just as a bonus. The iced east winds that knife us. And I'm actually just going to paste it without any formatting. There we go. Now I'm going to do a deep analysis. So the use of the word iced shows the extreme cold, which would be very unpleasant to face. Furthermore, let's make this paragraph a little bit bigger so you can see a bit more. Furthermore, the use of the personification of the wind into a criminal element that would knife soldiers adds to the suffering, as it is as it creates a sense of constant threat. I'll just take out that. It's okay to reference the quote if you can't use the exact word for the tense, so that's fine. That would knife the soldiers, adds to the suffering, creates a sense of constant threat. Furthermore, the use, Owen's use of ellipsis at the end of the line slows the pace of the poem and puts more emphasis on this image of the weather as the main enemy. Now, I personally would recommend, if you have time, trying to get a second quote into the paragraph. I feel like we definitely do have enough time to do that based on the speed at which I'm going. So I'm going to add in this second quote, which I got right near the end, didn't I? So furthermore, the synecdoche of eyes are ice shows the extreme suffering which the soldiers must endure from the weather. Firstly, the idea that their eyes have frozen is an extreme image to show the extreme cold of their deaths. Secondly, the idea that the soldier who has died has become ice itself is very symbolic, since it shows that the cold has penetrated through the soldier completely changed who he is. And then we want to finish up with a little bit of reader response. Now, I wouldn't typically plan out the reader response that much. I would just use my common sense of how the reader would receive this. As the reader, we feel extreme pathos for the soldiers, and this notion that the weather is the main enemy may also change our understanding of war and what it entails. Okay, so that's one good paragraph for you on how we would do an unseen thing. I don't know exactly how many minutes I took to write that, but I'm going to guess it was about 6 or 7 minutes to write that. You might need slightly longer than that if you're doing, if you're given a bit more time, do a bit more, obviously. Base it on your mark scheme, base it on what you need to do for your exam. Just based on AQA, I would recommend you spend about 35 minutes on this 24 mark unseen question. And so you can afford to spend 7, 8, 9 minutes maybe at a push per paragraph, and I would recommend 3 of them. But there's one for you. So hopefully that was helpful. I personally found that really fun, just like putting myself under time pressure. I don't expect you to be able to come up with quite this much stuff within 10 minutes as I did. I've been doing this for over 10 years. But what I would say is remember my advice. If you don't see anything much in a paragraph or a stanza, don't force it. So I didn't really see much in this on first glance. Now I could go through it. I could do, the flowing flakes that flock, the alliteration of that. I don't know if it links to suffering. I'm not going to waste time. I'm under exam pressure, time pressure. So I'm going to look for the stuff that I can see shows suffering, and I'm going to write about that. So yeah, I think that's everything for this video. If you liked it, please give a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, please comment down below. I'll see you in the next one.